At exactly 5:02 a.m., while I was standing barefoot in my kitchen waiting for my coffee to brew before heading into the lab, my phone lit up with a message from my sister Patricia. "Something's wrong. Don't come home." That was it. No explanation, no detail, just those words sitting there like they were supposed to mean something. And maybe they should have. But Patricia had a habit of turning everything into a crisis. A late delivery became a disaster. A minor argument became everything falling apart. So I stared at the message for a few seconds, felt that brief flicker of unease in my chest, and then I set my phone face down on the counter and went back to my morning. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I had work to get to, responsibilities that mattered more than whatever exaggeration she had decided to send before sunrise. Hours later, when my aunt called me 5 times in a row, her voice shaking as she said, "They're tearing it down," I finally understood that the one time I should have listened, I didn't. And by then, it was already too late. The coffee machine clicked softly as it finished brewing, a sound I had heard every morning for years, steady and predictable in a way my family never was. I poured the coffee into my mug and leaned against the counter for a second, letting the quiet of the early morning settle around me. Outside, the sky was still dark, the city not fully awake yet, and for a moment everything felt controlled, measured, the way my life had been since I built it away from them. I picked up my phone again before leaving, more out of habit than concern. The message was still there. "Something's wrong. Don't come home." I noticed the timestamp again, 5:02 a.m., which was unusual even for Patricia. She wasn't someone who woke up early unless there was a reason, and even then, her reasons rarely held weight. For a second, I considered calling her. The wording felt different this time, shorter, less dramatic, almost like she hadn't had time to build a story around it. But that thought passed as quickly as it came. I had a full schedule waiting for me, and I wasn't about to let one vague message pull me back into something I had spent years creating distance from. By 5:30 a.m., I was in my car, driving through the quiet streets of Austin while the world was still in that in-between state before sunrise. The radio played softly in the background, something I wasn't really listening to, and the roads were almost empty. I drove the same route I always did, turned at the same lights, followed the same rhythm that had become routine. And somewhere along the way, I forgot about the message completely. That was the thing about growing up in a family like mine. You learn to filter. You learn what deserves your attention and what doesn't. You learn that reacting to everything only pulls you deeper into chaos. Patricia had trained all of us, intentionally or not, to treat her warnings as noise. When I arrived at the lab, everything shifted back into the version of myself I trusted. Clean workstations, controlled temperatures, the low hum of equipment running tests that could determine whether something worked or failed. There was no ambiguity there, no manipulation, just results. It was the one place where things made sense without needing interpretation. I settled into my station, reviewed the data from the previous day, and started running through the morning checks. Time moved the way it always did when I was focused, steady, and unbroken. If my phone vibrated in my pocket, I didn't notice. If there were more messages, I ignored them without even realizing it. It wasn't until around 9:10 a.m. that something finally interrupted that rhythm. My phone buzzed once, then again, rapid enough to break through my concentration. I stepped away from the workstation and pulled it out, expecting something work-related, maybe an update or a delay. Instead, I saw 5 missed calls from my aunt and another one coming in. I answered this time, the unease from earlier returning instantly, sharper now, impossible to ignore. "Helena, where are you?" she asked, her voice tight, rushed in a way I had never heard before. "I'm at work," I said. "What's going on?" There was a pause, like she was trying to find the right words and couldn't. Then she said it quickly, almost like she needed to get it out before she lost the nerve. "They're tearing it down." I frowned, not understanding. "What do you mean?" Another pause. Shorter this time, heavier. "The bookstore, Helena," she said. "Your grandparents' bookstore. They brought machines. They're breaking it." For a second, I didn't move. The lab around me faded into something distant, the noise of equipment turning into background static. I didn't ask who they were. I didn't need to. I already knew. My eyes dropped to my phone, and that message from 5:02 a.m. suddenly felt different. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, a warning. And in that moment, standing in a place built on logic and control, I realized that everything outside of it was already collapsing without me. The drive back from the lab felt longer than it should have, but somewhere between the second red light and the third time I replayed my aunt's voice in my head, I stopped thinking about distance and started thinking about where all of this really began. Because nothing that was happening to the bookstore that morning was sudden. It only looked sudden if you ignored the years that came before it. I grew up in that bookstore long before it legally became mine, and my earliest memories weren't of toys or birthday parties, but of narrow aisles lined with wooden shelves, the quiet weight of books stacked in careful order, and the soft sound of pages turning in a room that never needed to be loud to feel alive. My grandmother used to keep a small pot of coffee going behind the counter, and the smell of it would mix with paper and dust in a way that still felt familiar even now, even standing miles away in a sterile lab. My grandfather treated the store like a system that had to be maintained, not improved for the sake of appearances, not expanded for the sake of profit, just kept steady so it could last. Every book had a place, every transaction was recorded, every small repair handled before it turned into something bigger. He didn't explain things often, but when he did, it was always simple. "Things last when you take care of them before they break," he told me once, and I understood that applied to more than just the building. My grandmother made the place feel different, warmer. She knew customers by name, remembered what they liked, set aside books she thought would matter to them. People didn't just come there to buy something. They came because it felt like a place that held on to something they didn't want to lose. And growing up in that environment, I learned how to be quiet, how to observe, how to understand value without needing it to be explained in numbers. My parents never saw it that way. To them, the bookstore was always something small, something that never became what they thought it should be. When they visited, it was never about what the place meant, only about what it could have been if it had been handled differently. There were always comments about how it could be modernized, expanded, turned into something more profitable, but they never stayed long enough to understand why it had never been built that way. Patricia didn't even pretend to understand it. She avoided the bookstore whenever she could, treating it like something outdated, something that didn't belong in the kind of life she wanted. By the time she was old enough to form her own opinions, she had already decided that anything quiet or consistent was a waste of time, and my parents never corrected that perspective. If anything, they reinforced it. It showed in ways that didn't seem important at first. The way my achievements were acknowledged and then dismissed, while Patricia's smallest decisions were treated like something that needed attention and support. The way my time at the bookstore was seen as optional, while her interests, no matter how temporary, were treated as something worth investing in. I didn't argue about it, because arguing never changed anything. It only gave them more space to explain why I was wrong. When my grandparents started getting older, I spent more time there without being asked, driving them to appointments, helping with inventory, managing the store when my grandfather's hands weren't steady enough to handle the paperwork. It wasn't something I did for recognition. It was something that felt necessary, like maintaining something that would otherwise be lost if no one paid attention. I remember one night in particular, a few months before my grandfather passed. The store had closed early, and we were sitting in the back office surrounded by records and old receipts. He looked at me for a long time before speaking, the way he always did when he was deciding whether something needed to be said. "This place doesn't need someone who wants to change it," he said. "It needs someone who understands why it exists." He didn't say anything else after that, and he didn't need to. When both of my grandparents passed within the same year, everything shifted quickly. At first, it was quiet. Grief, arrangements, the kind of conversations that stay on the surface because no one wants to say what they're really thinking yet. But within weeks, the tone changed. Conversations about memory turned into conversations about value, about what the property was worth, about what could be done with it, about how it could finally become something more. The will was read in a lawyer's office downtown, and unlike the tension building in my family, the document itself was clear. The bookstore, the building, everything associated with it was left entirely to me. Not divided, not shared, not conditional. There was a silence after that, but it wasn't confusion. It was calculation. My parents didn't react immediately. Patricia didn't say anything at all. But I saw the shift in their expressions, subtle but unmistakable. It wasn't about loss anymore. It was about control. At first, they framed it as concern. Questions about whether I could handle the responsibility, whether I understood what it would take to maintain the property, whether it made sense for me to keep something that wasn't generating what they considered real income. It sounded reasonable if you didn't look too closely, but the more they spoke, the more it became clear they weren't asking questions. They were testing limits. And by the time I turned 25, I already understood something they didn't realize I had figured out. The bookstore wasn't just something I inherited, it was something I was going to have to defend. By the time I turned 25, the conversations about the bookstore stopped sounding like suggestions and started sounding like decisions that had already been made without me. It didn't happen all at once, and that was what made it easy to miss at first, because each conversation on its own felt reasonable, almost harmless, until you realized they were all pointing in the same direction. My dad was the first to shift into numbers. He would bring up property values in the area, pulling up listings on his phone and turning the screen toward me like he was presenting something undeniable. "Do you realize what that land is worth now?" he would say, tapping the display as if that alone should settle the conversation. My mom followed with softer language, talking about timing, about opportunities, about how I could use this moment to build something bigger than what my grandparents had left behind. Patricia didn't bother with any of that. She leaned against the counter one afternoon, looking around the store like she was already bored of it. "You're sitting on something that could actually make money," she said. "Books don't do that anymore. People want places they can go, not just things they can read." I didn't respond. I let them talk, because I had learned that reacting too quickly only made it easier for them to redirect the conversation. If I stayed quiet, they revealed more than they intended to. The first time they brought me something concrete, I knew it wasn't just an idea anymore. My dad showed up at my apartment with a folder, the kind people use when they believe they're about to finalize something. Inside were printed layouts for a restaurant. Clean, modern designs, open spaces, outdoor seating, everything carefully planned down to details I hadn't agreed to. "We've already talked to someone who can handle the transition," he said, placing the folder in front of me. "You wouldn't have to manage anything. You'd just be part of the ownership structure." That phrase stood out immediately. Part of the ownership, not the owner. I flipped through the pages slowly, taking in the timelines, the projected revenue, the demolition schedule outlined like it was already approved. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a plan waiting for me to sign something. "I'm not selling," I said, closing the folder. My mom leaned forward slightly, her tone still calm but more controlled now. "We're not asking you to sell," she said. "We're asking you to think beyond what it is now." Patricia let out a quiet laugh. "Or at least think realistically." I slid the folder back across the table. "I already am," I said. That was the moment the conversation changed. After that, they stopped trying to convince me directly. Instead, they started approaching it from different angles. Small comments about how expensive it would be to maintain the property, questions about taxes and repairs, subtle suggestions that I might not be equipped to handle it on my own. Each one was designed to introduce doubt, not all at once, but slowly enough that it would feel like my own conclusion. At the same time, Patricia started showing up at the bookstore more often, which in itself was unusual. She didn't help. She didn't even pretend to. She walked through the aisles like she was evaluating something, taking photos, asking questions about how many customers came in each day, what the busiest hours were, how much revenue the store actually made. One afternoon, I walked into the back office and found her going through old financial records without asking. "What are you doing?" I asked. She didn't look up right away. "Trying to understand what you're working with," she said casually. I took the folder from her hands and placed it back in the drawer. You don't need to, I said. She looked at me then, a small smile forming that didn't reach her eyes. We'll see, she replied. That was when I realized this wasn't just pressure anymore. It was preparation. A few days later, my mom called me about paperwork. She said there were documents that would make things easier for everyone, something that would allow my dad to help manage the property while I focused on my work. Temporary authorization, she called it. Something simple, something practical. I'm not signing anything, I told her. You haven't even looked at it, she replied. I don't need to, I said. There was a pause, followed by a quiet exhale that felt more calculated than disappointed. You're making this harder than it needs to be, she said. I ended the call without answering. That night, I sat in the bookstore after closing, going through the same records Patricia had been looking at earlier. Not because I needed to check the numbers, but because I needed to confirm something else, whether anything had already been done without me knowing. That was when I decided not to wait. The next morning, I scheduled a meeting with a property attorney. I explained everything, not emotionally, just facts. Ownership, inheritance, recent behavior, the documents they had tried to introduce. He listened without interrupting, then asked one question. Do you believe they would act without your consent? He asked. Yes, I said. He nodded, like that answer confirmed something. Then he walked me through my position, what was protected, what could be challenged, what I needed to watch for. The deed was clear. The ownership was mine. No one could legally change that without me, but that didn't mean they wouldn't try. When I left his office, I wasn't angry. I wasn't even surprised anymore. I was prepared, and by the end of that week, I had already taken steps they didn't know about. I just didn't realize how soon I was going to need them. I didn't remember making the decision to leave work that morning. It just happened somewhere between my aunt's voice breaking on the phone and the moment I realized I couldn't sit in that lab pretending everything was normal while something was being torn apart miles away. I told my supervisor I had a family emergency, packed my things without explaining further, and walked out with a calm that didn't match what was happening underneath. The drive back felt heavier than usual, not slower, just harder to move through, like every mile carried more weight than the last. My phone sat on the passenger seat, lighting up occasionally, but I didn't check it. I didn't need more details. I already knew who was responsible. The only thing I didn't know was how far they had gone. About 10 minutes away, I passed a truck carrying construction equipment heading in the opposite direction, and for a second, I wondered if it had come from my property. The thought stayed with me longer than it should have, settling somewhere I couldn't ignore. When I turned onto the street where the bookstore stood, I saw it before I even parked. Dust hanging in the air, the sound of machinery cutting through what should have been a quiet morning, and something missing from the front of the building that I couldn't fully process yet. I pulled over without turning off the engine and just sat there for a moment staring. The sign was gone. The wooden sign my grandfather had carved himself, the one that had hung above the entrance for as long as I could remember, was no longer there. In its place was an empty space, the faint outline still visible where it had been mounted. That was the first thing that made everything real. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the building, not rushing, not reacting the way they probably expected me to. The closer I got, the more details came into focus. Part of the front wall had already been broken through, bricks scattered across the ground. One of the windows was gone, replaced with a temporary barrier. And just beyond that, a compact excavator sat at an angle, its arm still, like it was waiting for the next instruction. Someone had already decided this place didn't need to exist anymore. I kept walking. They were all there. My dad stood near the entrance, talking to one of the workers like he was in charge of everything happening. My mom was a few steps behind him, holding a clipboard, reviewing something with a man I didn't recognize. Patricia was closer to the machine, pointing toward the back section of the building, explaining something with an energy I had never seen her show for anything in her life. She looked excited. When my dad noticed me, he didn't look surprised. He looked like he had expected me eventually, just not this soon. "You made it," he said, like I had arrived late to something we had all agreed on. I stopped a few feet away. "What is this?" I asked. My mom stepped in before he answered, her tone controlled. "We were going to talk to you," she said. "This just moved a little faster than expected." That phrasing was deliberate, like timing was the issue, not the fact that they were tearing down something that didn't belong to them. Patricia turned toward me, brushing dust off her hands. "You're welcome, by the way," she said. "We're fixing it." I didn't respond. I let my eyes move past them, taking everything in. On the side of the building, a large printed board stood on a frame. Architectural renderings, glass panels, outdoor seating, a restaurant, the exact plan they had shown me weeks earlier. They hadn't changed anything. They had just removed me from it. "You don't have the right to do this," I said. My dad shook his head slightly, like I was missing something obvious. "We do," he replied. "We took care of the paperwork." That was the moment everything slowed down. I didn't ask what paperwork. I didn't demand to see it, because I already understood what that meant, and more importantly, I knew something they didn't. They believed whatever they had was enough. Patricia stepped closer, lowering her voice slightly. "You should have listened when we gave you the chance," she said. "This would have been easier." I met her eyes for a second, then looked past her again toward the machine, the broken wall, the missing sign. All of it already done, already irreversible in the way they intended, but not in the way they thought. Behind me, I heard a car door close, then another. The sound didn't register to anyone else. The workers kept moving, my parents kept talking. Patricia turned back toward the foreman, continuing her explanation like nothing had changed. I didn't turn around immediately. I let them have those last few seconds, the ones where they still believed they were in control, because by the time they realized who had just arrived behind me, everything they thought they had secured was already starting to fall apart. I didn't turn around right away when I heard the car doors close behind me, because timing mattered, and this was the moment everything shifted from what they thought they were doing to what was actually happening. I stepped slightly to the side, just enough to open the space behind me. And that was when my dad noticed them. His expression changed first, not dramatically, but enough for me to see it. A man in a dark suit stood a few feet behind me, holding a folder with the kind of quiet certainty that didn't need explanation. Next to him stood a uniformed officer, calm, observant, already taking in everything that had been set in motion before they arrived. "Who is this?" my mom asked, her voice tightening as she turned. The man didn't rush. He walked forward at a measured pace and stopped where he could be seen by everyone. "Daniel Mercer," he said evenly. "I represent Helena Rhodes regarding this property." My dad straightened slightly, trying to regain control of the situation. "We don't know who you are," he said. "This is a family matter." Daniel nodded once. "That may be how you see it," he replied. "Legally, it is not." The officer stepped forward just enough to shift the atmosphere. "We're going to need all activity to stop," he said calmly. The workers reacted first. One lowered his tool, another stepped back from the broken wall. The machine operator cut the engine, and the sudden silence made everything sharper, more exposed. Dust still hung in the air, but now there was nothing covering what had already been done. For the first time that morning, no one was following my father's instructions. "There's no need for this," my dad said, pushing forward, trying to regain momentum. "We have documentation." He reached into his folder and pulled out a set of papers, holding them up like proof that everything was already settled. "This property has been transferred," he added, his voice more forceful now. Daniel didn't argue. He simply held out his hand. "May I see that?" There was a brief hesitation, but my dad handed the papers over, still confident enough to believe they would hold up. Daniel opened the folder and began flipping through the pages, steady, unhurried, like this was routine. No one spoke while he read. My mom watched his face, trying to anticipate his reaction. Patricia crossed her arms, shifting slightly, still holding on to the confidence she had a few minutes earlier. Ray stepped closer, looking over Daniel's shoulder as if proximity could influence the outcome. Daniel didn't react the way they expected. He didn't question anything out loud. He didn't hesitate. He just read, then went back to the beginning and checked specific sections again. When he finally looked up, his expression hadn't changed at all. "These documents are not valid," he said. The words landed without force, but they cut through everything. "That's not possible," my dad said immediately. "We had them notarized." Daniel tapped a section of the page. "The notary information listed here does not match any active registration," he said, "and the signatures attributed to the original owners are inconsistent with verified records." My mom shook her head quickly. "We used an online service," she said. "It's legal." "Some services are valid," Daniel replied. "This one is not." Then he added, "And attempting to use invalid documentation to transfer property without authorization can carry legal consequences." The officer stepped in again, reinforcing what had already been said. "We need to verify ownership before anything continues," he said. "At this time, no one here has demonstrated authority to make changes to this property." "That's not true," Patricia said quickly. "We signed everything. I signed it myself." The moment the words left her mouth, everything shifted. She froze slightly, realizing what she had just said. My dad turned toward her, sharp, but it was too late. Daniel's attention moved to her briefly, then back to my dad. "Who completed these filings?" he asked. "We handled it," my dad said after a pause. "As a family." Daniel nodded once. "Understood," he said. The officer looked toward the broken section of the building, then back at my father. "Who authorized the equipment and the work crew?" he asked. My dad hesitated again. "We did." The officer's tone remained calm. "At this point, I'm instructing all work to stop immediately," he said. "No further activity will continue until ownership is confirmed." The workers didn't wait for clarification. They stepped back completely, tools lowered, attention no longer on my father but on the officer. My mom's voice dropped, thinner now. "This is a misunderstanding," she said. "We're just trying to help." Daniel didn't respond to that. He reached into his own folder and pulled out a set of documents, clean, organized, already prepared. He handed the top page to the officer, then turned slightly toward my parents. "These are the current legal records for the property," he said. I didn't move. I didn't need to. I just stood there, watching as everything they had built in their heads began to collapse, not through argument, not through emotion, but through something they couldn't manipulate. And as the officer began reading, I already knew this was only the beginning of what they were about to lose. The officer read the document slowly, line by line, without reacting, and that silence stretched long enough to force everyone else to wait in it. No one interrupted him. No one tried to explain. Even my father, who rarely let silence exist in his presence, stood still, watching. When the officer finally looked up, his attention moved directly to me. "Ms. Rhodes," he said, "you are listed here as the sole legal owner of this property." "Yes," I replied. He nodded once, then turned to my father. "Based on these records, you do not have authorization to make changes to this property or remove anything from it." The statement landed without emotion, but it carried more weight than anything that had been said that morning. "We're her parents," my dad said, reaching for the argument he had always relied on. "We're acting in her best interest." "That does not override legal ownership," the officer replied. For the first time, that argument didn't work. My mom stepped forward, her tone softening, trying to reframe the situation. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said. "We thought everything had been handled properly." Daniel responded before I could. "The documentation you presented is not recognized as valid," he said. "And the actions taken here today may be classified as unauthorized property damage." The word damage changed everything. My Uncle Ray reacted first. "No one is damaging anything," he said sharply. "We're improving it." Daniel didn't raise his voice. "Intent does not change ownership," he replied. That was the moment it stopped being a disagreement and became something else entirely. The officer glanced toward the partially destroyed wall, then back at my father. "Who authorized the equipment and the crew?" he asked. My dad hesitated, just long enough to matter. "We did." The officer nodded slightly. "Then you need to understand that continuing any work without authorization may result in legal consequences," he said. My mom's composure slipped for a second. "Legal consequences?" she repeated. Daniel reached into his folder and pulled out a single document. He didn't wave it or present it dramatically. He simply held it in a way that made it visible. "This is a prepared notice regarding the attempted unauthorized transfer and actions taken today," he said. "It can be filed if necessary." He didn't threaten. He just showed them what already existed. Ray took a step back. Patricia's expression shifted, the confidence she had earlier replaced with something closer to panic. My father looked at the document but didn't reach for it, like acknowledging it would make everything final. "This is ridiculous," my mom said quietly. "We're not criminals." No one answered her, because no one needed to. The officer turned back to me. "Do you want them to leave the property?" he asked. The question hung there, heavier than anything else that had been said. It wasn't about documents anymore. It was about control. I looked at the building, at the broken wall, the missing sign, the machine sitting silent where it had been moments earlier. Everything they had already taken. Then I looked back at him. "Yes," I said. "I want them to stop and leave." My mom inhaled sharply. "Helena," she started. I didn't look at her. The officer nodded once and turned to my father. "You need to instruct your crew to stop and prepare to leave," he said. "If you refuse, this will escalate to trespass enforcement." My father stood still for a moment, his expression tightening as he tried to find something he could still control. Then he turned toward the workers. "Stop," he said. "We're done here." The same voice that had been giving orders minutes earlier was now ending them. The workers moved quickly, stepping back from the structure, gathering their equipment, preparing to leave. No hesitation, no questions. My mom looked at me then, really looked at me, not as a daughter but as someone she didn't recognize anymore. "You planned this," she said quietly. "I prepared," I replied. That was the difference. Ray muttered something under his breath, frustrated but contained. Patricia stepped back, physically distancing herself from the center of the situation, like space could separate her from what had just happened. The officer handed a printed notice to my parents, then to Ray. "You are not to return to this property without permission," he said. "If you do, further action will be taken." My father took the paper, his expression hardening, but not in the way it had earlier. This wasn't confidence anymore. It was something colder. "This isn't over," he said. Daniel wrote something down in his notebook without reacting. "Noted," he replied. For the first time, the outcome wasn't something my family could decide. One by one, they started to leave. My mom first, then Ray, then Patricia, who didn't look at me again before walking away. My father stayed for a second longer, like he wanted to say something else but didn't. Then he turned and followed them. The sound of engines replaced the noise of machinery. The dust began to settle. The street slowly returned to quiet. But it wasn't over. Because as the last car disappeared, Daniel stepped closer to me, his voice low. "There's something else," he said. I turned toward him. "What?" He opened his folder and showed me a page that looked different from the others. "This wasn't the only attempt," he said. I read it quickly, my eyes scanning the entries, and felt something shift again, colder this time, clearer. They hadn't just tried to take the bookstore today. They had been working toward it long before I ever saw it coming. I stood there for a few seconds after the last car disappeared, the silence settling in around the building in a way that made everything feel sharper, clearer, more defined. The dust was still in the air, the broken walls still exposed, but the chaos was gone, and what remained was something I could actually work with. "What do you mean it wasn't the only attempt?" I asked, turning toward Daniel. He didn't answer right away. He adjusted the papers in his folder and turned one page toward me so I could read it. It wasn't a formal document. It was a record, a list of filings connected to the property over the past few weeks. There were multiple entries, different dates, slight variations in wording, each one trying to establish some form of shared ownership or authorization, and each one rejected. "They weren't waiting for you to agree," Daniel said. "They were trying to create a version of reality that would eventually hold up on paper." I read through the entries again, recognizing the pattern immediately. Small changes each time, like they were testing what might get accepted. "They were building a trail," I said. He nodded. "And if one of these had gone through even partially, it would have complicated everything." That was when it fully settled in. This wasn't impulsive, it wasn't emotional, it was calculated. "They were going to make me fight for it," I said quietly. Daniel didn't respond to that directly. "Now we decide what happens next," he said instead. I looked back at the building, at what had already been done, at what had almost happened. "What are the options?" I asked. "Control," he said, "not reaction." He outlined the steps clearly, the same way he had handled everything else. Secure the property, restrict access, notify the county to flag any future filings, prepare a formal response if they tried to escalate, build a record that made it difficult for them to attempt anything again. "And the damage?" I asked, glancing toward the broken section of the wall. "That becomes part of the case," he said. "You can pursue it if you want, or you can use it as leverage to make sure they don't come back." I considered that for a moment. "I don't want this to continue," I said. "I want it to stop." Daniel studied me briefly, then nodded. "Then we create consequences that are automatic," he said. "Not emotional, legal." That was the difference. We walked through the property together after that, not as a reaction, but as an assessment. He took photos, notes, measurements, every detail documented: the broken wall, the removed sign, the machine tracks in the dirt. Even the placement of tools that had been left behind, even the smallest detail mattered. By the time we finished, the situation had shifted again. The chaos of the morning was gone, replaced with structure, process, something that could be controlled. After Daniel left to begin preparing the formal documents, I stayed behind. The bookstore felt different now, not because of what had been taken, but because of what had been exposed. The air still carried traces of dust, and the empty space where the sign had been felt more noticeable now that everything was quiet. My phone buzzed. I didn't need to check to know who it was. When I finally looked, I saw multiple missed calls from my mom, followed by a message. "We need to talk. This went too far." I read it once, then set the phone back down without responding. For the first time, I wasn't the one being pulled into the conversation. A few minutes later, it rang again. This time, I answered. My dad's voice came through first, controlled but tight. "You embarrassed us today," he said. "You brought police into a family situation." I leaned against the counter, looking at the damaged wall. "You brought equipment onto my property," I replied. There was a pause. My mom took the phone. "We were trying to help you," she said, her tone softening. "You don't understand what it takes to manage something like that." I let her finish. "I understand it enough to know you don't have permission to be there," I said. Silence. They weren't used to that. "You're making a mistake," my dad said finally. "This could have been something bigger." "It already is," I replied. "Not louder, not sharper, just clear." Another pause. "You'll be hearing from our attorney," he said. "I'll have mine respond," I said. He ended the call. I set the phone down and didn't pick it up again. That evening, I made a list. Locks, security cameras, access control, notifications. Every step Daniel had outlined, broken down into something I could execute without hesitation. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for them to act. I was closing every space they had used. The next morning, I started implementing everything. New locks installed, access points secured, county notifications sent, each action small on its own, but together forming something they couldn't easily get around. By midday, Daniel confirmed the formal notice had been sent to their attorney. No direct contact. All communication through legal channels. Any further attempt to access the property would be documented. I read the message twice, then filed it away. Not because I needed to remember it, because I wanted a record. This wasn't about winning. It was about making sure there was nothing left for them to take. Later that afternoon, Daniel forwarded me a response from their attorney. I opened it, expecting resistance. Instead, I saw something else entirely. They weren't backing down. They were changing how they were going to fight. I didn't open the response from their attorney right away. I let it sit on my screen while I finished installing the last lock on the front door, tightening the final screw until the metal clicked into place with a clean, steady sound that felt more real than anything written in that email. When I finally read it, it wasn't aggressive. It wasn't even particularly confrontational. It was careful, structured in a way that avoided direct claims while quietly stepping back from everything they had tried to assert. Their attorney stated that his clients may have misunderstood prior arrangements and were requesting time to reassess their position. No accusations, no demands, just distance. It wasn't a fight anymore, it was a retreat. Daniel called me not long after, his voice steady as always. "They're pulling back," he said. "Not because they want to, but because they don't have anything they can defend." I looked around the bookstore while he spoke, at the broken section of the wall that had already been covered, at the shelves still standing, at the parts that mattered and had survived. "What happens next?" I asked. "They either let it go," he said, "or they try something smaller, quieter, but either way, we're prepared." That word again, prepared, and for the first time it didn't feel like a reaction. It felt like control. Over the next few days, I focused on restoring what had been disrupted, not rushing, not trying to erase what happened, just rebuilding it the way it was meant to be handled, carefully, deliberately, without turning it into something it wasn't. I worked with a contractor to repair the structure, but everything else I did myself, cleaning, organizing, putting each book back in its place, restoring the rhythm that had always defined the space. I didn't replace the sign right away. I left the empty space above the entrance for a few days, not as a statement, just as a reminder of what had been taken and what had been protected. Daniel confirmed later that week that their attorney had formally withdrawn any claim to shared ownership, no further filings, no new attempts, the record clean and stable. My parents didn't call again. Patricia didn't message. There was no apology, no explanation, no effort to repair anything beyond what they had already lost. And for the first time, I realized I didn't need any of that. Silence, in this case, was the outcome. A week later, I installed a new sign above the entrance. Simple, consistent, nothing designed to attract attention, just something that belonged there. When I stepped back and looked at it, I didn't feel relief in the way people expect after something like this. I felt something quieter, something more stable, something I hadn't felt before when it came to my family. Control. Not over them, but over my own space, my own decisions, my own boundaries. They didn't lose because I fought them. They lost because I stopped letting them define the rules. A few days after everything settled, I received a message from a number I didn't recognize, short, direct, asking if I knew a good attorney. There was no context, but I understood what it meant. Someone else was dealing with something similar. Someone else was at the point where they needed to decide whether to react or prepare. I sent Daniel's contact information and left it at that, because sometimes the most effective thing you can give someone isn't advice, it's a path. That evening, I sat outside the bookstore as the sun went down, the street quiet again, the way it had always been before that morning at 5:02 a.m. My phone was on the table beside me, silent, no missed calls, no messages waiting to pull me back into something I had already stepped out of. I thought about that message again. "Something's wrong. Don't come home." And realized she had been right, just not in the way she understood. Something had been wrong for a long time, building quietly, waiting for the moment it would finally surface, and when it did, it wasn't something I could ignore anymore. but I didn't go back to fix it. I didn't try to repair something that had never been built on the right foundation. I just made sure it couldn't happen again. Because sometimes the strongest response isn't loud, it isn't emotional, it isn't about proving anything to anyone. It's quiet, it's structured, and it's final. And if you've ever been told that you were overreacting, that you didn't understand what was best for you, or that you should just go along to keep the peace, maybe you weren't wrong for questioning it. Maybe what you felt was the moment you started seeing the pattern clearly. If you were in my position, would you have ignored that message at 5:02 a.m., or would you have gone back sooner? I'd really want to know what you think, because your answer might be exactly what someone else needs to hear right now. And if stories like this speak to you, where boundaries matter more than appearances and quiet decisions change everything, stay with the channel, share your perspective, and be part of a space where those choices actually mean something. This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.